You hear the words, violent crime, and you picture hardened adults, those who've spent years getting used to the dark side of life. But what if I told you the most shocking, most chilling acts of violence aren't always committed by adults? What if the real horrors come from children, young minds still in their teens, still developing, still learning, yet capable of unthinkable acts? Imagine this, a 14-year-old kid just out of middle school standing in a courtroom accused of murder. Is crime so brutal, so unexpected it shook an entire community to its core? And he's not alone. There are others, kids who've committed acts so terrible, so senseless, that they've been locked away for life, forever branded by their actions. Today we're taking you inside the stories of 5 of the most dangerous juveniles ever to be sentenced to life in prison. These are real stories, stories ripped from headlines, courtrooms, and public records. Stories of shocking violence, dark psychology, and questions that remain unanswered. What would drive a young person to commit such horrific acts? And what happens when a child's actions lead to consequences they can never undo? Stay with us as we dive into the chilling tales of these young criminals and explore the darkness inside. If you're ready to uncover the shocking truth behind these crimes and understand what could drive a child to such unspeakable acts, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't miss the full story of these dangerous juveniles and the twisted paths that led them to prison. Case number 1. Philip Chism. He was just 14 years old when he walked the halls of Danvers High School in Massachusetts, a quiet, seemingly ordinary teenager with a shy demeanor that gave little indication of the darkness brewing beneath the surface. But what unfolded on a crisp October day in 2013 would reveal a horror so chilling, so unthinkable, that it would leave an entire community, and the nation, grappling for answers. Colleen Ritzer, a beloved 24-year-old math teacher known for her kindness, passion, and infectious love for teaching, had no reason to suspect that the student sitting quietly in her class was harboring something far more dangerous than adolescent angst. She stayed late after school to help students, unaware that one of them had been quietly planning her murder. On the afternoon of October 22, security cameras at Danvers High captured Philip Chism following Colleen into a second-floor bathroom. What happened next would remain out of sight, but the aftermath was a scene of unimaginable brutality. Chism attacked Colleen with a box cutter, inflicted multiple wounds, and then, calmly, methodically, dragged her body in a recycling bin through the school and into the woods behind the building, where he left her lifeless body under a pile of leaves. When Colleen didn't return home that evening, her parents reported her missing, and by the next morning a massive search had begun. But it was only a matter of hours before the grim truth was uncovered, as police located her body and arrested Chism, who was found walking along the highway carrying her bloody belongings, a box cutter, and a change of clothes. The trial that followed exposed a disturbing psychological portrait of a young killer. Chism remained silent, unremorseful, and emotionally detached. Forensic psychiatrists testified to signs of possible psychosis or trauma, but even those insights failed to explain the savagery of his actions, or the apparent lack of motive, other than a vague suggestion of rage when Colleen mentioned Tennessee, the state Philip had recently moved from. Prosecutors painted a picture of premeditation, citing how Chism had brought the murder weapon to school, how he changed clothes after the killing, and even attempted to clean the crime scene afterward, all while maintaining a calm, cold demeanor that left jurors stunned and disturbed. And in 2015, after deliberations that weighed his age against the sheer brutality of his actions, the court sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, a rare but legally required concession for juvenile offenders in Massachusetts. The murder of Colleen Ritzer shattered the illusion that such acts of violence were confined to dark alleys or urban crime scenes. Instead, it happened in a suburban school at the hands of a student, to a teacher who embodied everything good about education. Her death became a symbol, a painful reminder of how vulnerable even the safest spaces can be, and how the line between innocence and evil can be terrifyingly thin. To this day, the question lingers like an open wound. What could possibly drive a 14-year-old to commit such a monstrous act? Was it mental illness? Suppressed rage? Or was it something more chilling? The possibility that some people, even at a young age, are capable of extraordinary cruelty, hidden behind a boyish face and a quiet voice? Case number 2. Lionel Tate, the boy who wrestled with darkness. Lionel Tate was only 12 years old, a boy not even old enough for high school, when he committed a crime that would land him in the national spotlight and make history for all the wrong reasons. On the surface, Lionel was like many kids growing up in the late 1990s, fascinated by larger-than-life action heroes, adrenaline-fueled cartoons, and above all, the glitz and glamour of professional wrestling. He idolized stars like The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and The Undertaker. These were men who flew through the air, slammed their opponents with bone-crushing moves and always got back up. Lionel didn't just watch them, he studied them. He mimicked them. And in his young mind, the line between fantasy and reality began to blur. In July of 1999, Lionel's mother, Colleen Tate, a Florida State Highway Patrol officer, was asked to babysit 6-year-old Tiffany Unick, the daughter of a family friend. That night, she left Lionel and Tiffany alone in the living room of their modest Broward County home while she retreated upstairs. What happened over the next hour would forever shatter the innocence of childhood and spark one of the most controversial legal battles in modern American history. Lionel told investigators that he and Tiffany had been play wrestling, reenacting some of his favorite moves from the WWF, now WWE. But when Tiffany's small body was discovered lifeless, covered in bruises and injuries that would make even hardened detectives wince, the term play suddenly seemed horrifyingly inadequate. The autopsy revealed that Tiffany had suffered a fractured skull, a lacerated liver, internal bleeding, and over 30 separate injuries. The coroner's report stated bluntly, these injuries were not survivable and they were certainly not accidental. Still, Lionel insisted it had been a tragic mistake. A suplex gone wrong. A botched elbow drop. But the truth was far more complex. Experts struggled to understand how a 12-year-old could inflict such damage without either realizing or caring about the consequences. Some argued that Lionel had lost control in a fit of rage. Others pointed to his obsession with violent media, a growing concern at the time, and the role it might have played in desensitizing him to pain, injury, and even death. At his trial in 2001, the prosecution painted Lionel as a violent, dangerous young boy who knew exactly what he was doing. The defense, meanwhile, argued that he was mentally underdeveloped, had never meant to kill Tiffany, and was being scapegoated by a society unwilling to confront its own influence on youth. Nevertheless, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. And with that verdict, Lionel Tate became the youngest person in American history to be sentenced to life in prison without parole. The public reaction was intense and divided. Some viewed the verdict as necessary justice for a little girl who had been brutally killed. Others were stunned that a 12-year-old could be condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Child advocacy groups and international human rights organizations cried foul, arguing that such a sentence for a minor violated fundamental principles of justice and rehabilitation. Amid growing pressure, Lionel's sentence was eventually overturned in 2004. The court acknowledged that he had not received a proper mental competency hearing before his trial. After serving nearly 3 years, Lionel walked out of prison a free teenager, released into a world that would never see him the same way again. But freedom did not mean redemption. Lionel's life after release was marred by a string of poor decisions. In 2005, just a year after regaining his freedom, he was arrested again, this time for armed robbery. His probation was revoked and he was sent back to prison. Over the next several years, he would continue to find himself entangled with the justice system. A cycle of crime, arrest, and incarceration seemed to follow him like a shadow. Psychologists who evaluated Lionel during and after his legal troubles described him as emotionally stunted, impulsive, and likely suffering from conduct disorders that had gone untreated for years. His early fascination with violence had never been properly addressed. Instead, he was thrown into an adult prison system that critics say hardened him, rather than healed him. To this day, Lionel Tate's case is cited in debates over juvenile justice, raising fundamental questions that remain unresolved. How do we deal with children who commit unthinkable acts? Can they be rehabilitated, or are some too damaged, too dangerous to be saved? And what role does society itself play in shaping, or failing, its youth? The story of Lionel Tate is not just about a boy who committed a horrific crime. It's about the dangerous collision between fantasy and reality, childhood and violence, punishment and mercy. It's about the systems that failed both him and his victim. And it's a stark reminder that when we ignore the warning signs in our children, the consequences can be catastrophic, not just for them but for everyone around them. Case number 3, T.J. Lane, the teen who turned a school cafeteria into a crime scene. T.J. Lane was just 17 years old when he committed an act so brutal, so senseless, and so cold-blooded that it would carve a permanent scar into the soul of a small Ohio town and echo in headlines across the country. What happened inside Chardon High School on February 27, 2012, wasn't just another school shooting. It was a haunting revelation of how a quiet, brooding teenager with a tormented past and a twisted mind could erupt in unthinkable violence without warning, and leave behind a trail of shattered lives and unanswered questions. To many of his classmates and neighbors, T.J. Lane was something of a ghost, there but not really present. He wasn't the type to dominate conversations, join school clubs, or flash a charming smile in yearbook photos. He lived on the outskirts of the social world, drifting between invisibility and quiet observation. Though enrolled at an alternative school in the district due to behavioral issues and academic struggles, he still had ties to Chardon High School. And while he didn't stand out as particularly dangerous, there were subtle warning signs that something inside of him was deeply fractured. TJ's upbringing was steeped in trauma and instability. Born into a home plagued by violence, substance abuse, and neglect, he watched his parents go through bitter separations, accusations of domestic violence, and legal battles that tore through what little normalcy he might have had. Court documents would later reveal a home life marred by chaos. His father was repeatedly arrested for abusing his mother, and young TJ was often caught in the emotional crossfire. That early exposure to trauma, combined with relentless bullying and emotional isolation, helped shape a boy who was not only disconnected from others, but increasingly from reality itself. In the months leading up to the attack, there were disturbing hints of what might come. TJ began writing dark, disturbing content, including a chilling poem that spoke of blood, death, and retribution. Some of his classmates had dismissed it as dramatic teenage angst, but in hindsight, it read more like a manifesto, a preview of the violence he was preparing to unleash. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst or a breakdown. It was premeditated. It was personal. And it was designed to hurt as many people as possible, both physically and emotionally. That fateful morning, students filed into the cafeteria like they did every day, some still half asleep, others laughing and scrolling through their phones. TJ stood quietly in a corner, watching. Then, without a word, he pulled out a .22 caliber pistol that he had stolen from his grandfather. He walked over to a table of students he didn't have any known personal issue with, and began shooting. The shots rang out in terrifying succession, turning breakfast into a battlefield. Within moments, 3 students, Daniel Parmenter, Demetrius Hewlin, and Russell King Jr., lay fatally wounded. Others were injured. Some tried to run. Some froze. And TJ, shockingly calm, fled the scene, later to be found hiding in a wooded area nearby, the weapon still in his possession, along with a chilling handwritten note tucked into his clothes. That note would later be read in court, filled with cryptic phrases and disturbing rhetoric, reflecting a mind immersed in rage, delusion, and detachment. The true horror, however, would come not during the crime, but during the legal proceedings that followed. As the trial began, families of the victims packed the courtroom, seeking closure, justice, maybe even remorse. But what they saw was a teenager seemingly devoid of humanity. On the day of his sentencing, TJ Lane entered the courtroom with a chilling smirk, wearing a plain white undershirt with the word killer scrawled across it in black marker. The room fell into an eerie silence. The symbolism was cruel and deliberate. But what came next was even more appalling. When given the opportunity to address the court, Lane stood up, turned toward the victims' families, and delivered a short, vulgar statement laced with profanity, ending with an obscene gesture and the now infamous words. "This hand that pulled the trigger that killed your sons now masturbates to the memory. Fuck all of you." The families gasped in shock. Some wept uncontrollably. Others stared in disbelief, paralyzed by the depth of his malice. It was a moment that defied logic, that shattered every expectation of courtroom decorum and human decency. Psychologists who studied Lane described him as exhibiting signs of psychopathy, a chilling absence of empathy, an inflated sense of self, and an almost theatrical desire to dominate and provoke. This wasn't a boy lost in guilt or grief. This was a boy who relished his notoriety, who weaponized his courtroom appearance to inflict maximum emotional damage. The court responded with severity. TJ Lane was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, a clear message that there would be no second chances, no redemption arc, no future beyond prison walls. But even behind bars, Lane continued to spread fear. In 2014, he orchestrated a daring prison escape along with 2 other inmates, using crudely made tools to scale a fence under the cover of darkness. For several hours, the town of Lima, Ohio was on lockdown as authorities searched for the convicted killer. He was recaptured shortly after, but the news reopened old wounds for the victims' families and the Chardon community, who once again had to confront the specter of TJ Lane and the horror he left behind. TJ Lane's story is not just a grim chapter in the history of school shootings, it is a chilling examination of how pain, isolation, untreated trauma, and a thirst for control can ferment into something truly monstrous. He was not a child who simply snapped, he was a young man who plotted, executed, and reveled in the destruction he caused. And though he sits in a prison cell today, the ripple effects of his actions continue to haunt those who lived through that terrible day and the world that watched in disbelief as a teenage boy became a symbol of remorseless evil. Story 4. Mason Sisk, the 14-year-old family annihilator.
Mason Sisk, the Elkmont teenager convicted earlier this year of killing 5 of his family members in 2019, will spend his life in prison without the possibility of parole. That tops News 19 at 5. I'm Christine Killemeyer.
In the quiet rural town of Elkmont, Alabama, a place where neighbors know each other by name and family ties run deep, no one could have predicted that one of the most chilling and heartbreaking mass murders in the state's history would be committed not by a hardened criminal, but by a boy barely old enough to drive. Mason Sisk was just 14 years old when he shattered every notion of innocence and family by committing an act so brutal, so calculated, it would send shockwaves through the entire nation. On the night of September 2, 2019, Mason, calm, composed, and eerily cold, took a handgun from his home and methodically executed 5 members of his own family. His father, his stepmother, and his 3 younger siblings, including a baby who had only just begun to smile at the world. No fight. No warning. No mercy. Just death. To the outside world, the Sisk household seemed typical. A working-class family making their way in small-town Alabama. John Sisk, the father, was known as a kind and steady man. Mary, the stepmother, was a special education teacher, warm and maternal. Together, they were raising 3 children under the age of 6. And then there was Mason, the oldest, intelligent, polite, often quiet, but, as it would later be revealed, deeply disturbed. On that fateful evening, Mason waited patiently until everyone was home. Then, with chilling intent, he went room to room shooting each of his family members. The crime scene was described by investigators as something out of a horror film: blood-stained walls, lifeless bodies, and the silence of a home-turned mausoleum. Mason, showing no visible panic, called 911 and initially told police he had been in the basement when he heard gunshots. But the facade crumbled quickly. When confronted with evidence and mounting inconsistencies, he confessed. The news broke the next morning and the town of Elkmont was stunned. People gathered on porches in disbelief. Teachers wept. Friends asked how a kid like Mason, smart, athletic, even described as well-mannered by some, could do something so horrific. But as the investigation unfolded, a darker picture emerged. Mason had a history of behavioral issues. He had been suspended for violence at school, had shown signs of emotional instability, and, perhaps most disturbingly, reportedly had a fascination with violence and control. Friends and classmates described him as a loner, someone who kept to himself but seemed to carry a hidden resentment beneath the surface. One chilling detail came from a family member who later told authorities that Mason had recently found out Mary wasn't his biological mother, a revelation that seemed to unravel something inside him. Shortly afterward, according to reports, he began acting out more severely, showing open disrespect toward her and expressing hatred. But even with this knowledge, no one imagined he was capable of murder. Psychologists who later evaluated him debated over his mental state. Was he a cold-blooded killer born without empathy, or a product of emotional trauma, broken trust, and a deep-rooted identity crisis? Some saw the markers of antisocial personality disorder. Others speculated that he might have been experiencing a psychotic break, or that suppressed rage had finally erupted in a violent outburst. But in the end, the brutality of his actions spoke louder than any theory. Mason was arrested on the scene and charged with 5 counts of capital murder, an extremely rare charge for someone so young. Over the following years, the legal battle was long and complex. His defense team fought to suppress his confession, citing his age and lack of legal counsel. There were arguments about whether he should be tried as an adult or a juvenile. But the court ultimately ruled that the sheer gravity of the crime demanded full accountability. At the trial, Mason sat emotionless as prosecutors laid out the grisly details. He offered no apology, no visible remorse. Witnesses wept as they recounted the gentle lives of the victims, especially the children who would never grow up, never play again, never feel the warmth of a parent's embrace. The jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. In 2023, Mason Sisk was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A sentence that, for many, still felt too light for the magnitude of the crime, but one that sent a message: age cannot excuse intentional, calculated mass murder. Today, Mason sits in a maximum security prison, his future reduced to steel bars and silence. But outside those walls, the memory of the Sisk family lingers like a haunting echo through Elkmont. Photos of smiling children now rest in memorials. A town still asks itself how it missed the signs. And across the country, psychologists, parents, and lawmakers continue to wrestle with a terrifying question. What makes a child kill? Case number 5. Nehemiah Griego, the boy who turned on his blood.
Hearing Nehemiah Griego for the first time, he spoke to his sisters sitting on the benches in the courtroom.
I am sorry for taking our parents and our sins. I wish I can take it back.
In the early morning hours of January 19, 2013, in a modest home just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a silence hung heavy in the air, one not of peace, but of unspeakable horror, because inside that home lay the bodies of 5 family members, all murdered in their sleep by someone they trusted most. 15-year-old Nehemiah Griego, a boy who had grown up in the very house he turned into a crime scene. What followed would be one of the most haunting cases in recent memory: a teenage shooter, a shattered family, and a community left to wrestle with how a seemingly ordinary boy could commit such extraordinary evil. Born into a deeply religious household, Nehemiah was one of 10 children in a family known for their strong faith and musical talents. His father, Greg Griego, was a former gang member turned pastor, a man who had turned his life around and devoted himself to helping others find redemption. The Griego family was active in their church and well known throughout the community. But beneath the wholesome exterior, young Nehemiah was quietly unraveling, emotionally isolated, psychologically disturbed, and consumed by violent thoughts he never dared to share. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Nehemiah had reportedly become more withdrawn, spending long hours listening to heavy metal music, fantasizing about violence, and harboring deep resentment toward his family. He felt misunderstood, unwanted, and invisible in his own home. The disconnect grew so severe that it festered into something far darker: a desire to make the world notice him no matter the cost. On that chilling January morning, Nehemiah retrieved a .22 caliber rifle from his parents' closet. He walked into the bedroom where his mother, Sarah, lay sleeping and shot her in the head without hesitation. When his 9-year-old brother Zephaniah came to investigate the noise, Nehemiah shot him too. One by one he hunted down his younger sisters, 5-year-old Jael and 2-year-old Angelina, executing them with the same detached calm. Finally, when his father returned home from work, Nehemiah ambushed him, firing multiple rounds into his chest and face, completing a massacre that had been festering in his mind for days, maybe even years. But what's even more disturbing is what Nehemiah did next. Instead of running or panicking, he lingered in the house for hours, playing video games, listening to music, and contemplating his next move, while the bodies of his family members lay lifeless in the next room. Later, he loaded multiple firearms and ammunition into the family van, reportedly with plans to go on a killing spree at a local Walmart or church. He even texted a friend, hinting that something terrible had happened, before finally showing up at his church and confessing to a youth pastor, who alerted police. When officers arrived and took him in for questioning, they were struck by his calm, almost emotionless demeanor. There were no tears, no signs of remorse, just a chilling recounting of how he methodically ended the lives of those closest to him. It wasn't until the full details came to light that the magnitude of the tragedy truly hit the public. The legal case against Nehemiah Griego quickly became a lightning rod for national debate, not just about juvenile justice but about mental health, parental oversight, gun access, and the hidden lives of troubled teens. Initially, he was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder and 3 counts of child abuse resulting in death.
And is ready to move on and into the world.
I want no retaliation. I love you guys, and I want to see the best for y'all. And whatever you may do, and I do pray for you guys to have healing the way I'm having healing.
Aunts and uncles.
Prosecutors pushed to try him as an adult due to the premeditated nature of the crimes, while his defense team pointed to his young age, history of emotional instability, and the alleged neglect he suffered at home. Psychologists who evaluated Nehemiah found evidence of untreated depression, suicidal ideation, and possibly early signs of psychopathy. He had reportedly expressed a desire to become famous through violence, stating that he wanted to be remembered. There were also conflicting reports about whether he had suffered abuse or felt emotionally abandoned by his parents. The defense argued that Nehemiah was not beyond rehabilitation, while the prosecution maintained that the sheer brutality of his crimes required the harshest penalty. After years of legal back and forth, in 2019 Nehemiah Griego was finally sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences, plus 7 years, to be served in adult prison. The judge ruled that despite his age, the nature of his actions and his clear intent warranted the maximum penalty under the law. Today, Nehemiah remains behind bars, an image of lost innocence and dark potential. His case remains one of the most harrowing reminders of what can happen when mental illness, easy access to firearms, and family dysfunction intersect in the life of a young person already teetering on the edge. While the Griego home now stands empty, the questions linger in the New Mexico desert air. What signs were missed? Could this have been prevented? And how do we make sense of a boy who became the executioner of his own bloodline? These 5 cases are a stark reminder that even the youngest among us can commit the most heinous of acts. From emotional isolation to psychological disturbances and traumatic backgrounds, these stories underscore the importance of early intervention and the complexities of juvenile justice. If you found these stories shocking, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more chilling documentaries. Share your thoughts below. Should juveniles be held accountable like adults, or is there room for rehabilitation? We'd love to hear your opinion.